In March of 1959, a 9-year-old girl named Candy Rogers stepped off her porch in Spokane, Washington, to sell a few boxes of mints to her neighbors. She never made it home. What followed was a 62-year manhunt that outlived 2 generations of detectives, destroyed one innocent man's reputation, and was finally cracked open by a single accidental decision made by cops who had never even heard the words DNA profile. This is the story of how a 9-year-old girl was found, and lost, and found again, 62 years later. Her full name was Candace Elaine Rogers. She went by Candy. She was born on the 18th of July, 1949, the only child of Elaine and Carl Rogers Jr., who had divorced by the time this story begins. She lived with her mother above a neighborhood grocery store on Mission Avenue, in Spokane's West Central neighborhood. She was small for her age, 4 feet 4 inches, 60 pounds. And by the 4th grade at Holmes Elementary School, she had already built a reputation among the adults around her. Not for anything dramatic, for being reliable. Her school principal called her exactly that. Reliable, dependable, an excellent school citizen. Certainly not the type to do anything to worry anyone. Her Bluebird troop leader called her shy, but very friendly. On the 6th of March, 1959, a Friday, Candy picked up 7 boxes of campfire mints from her troop director's house on the way home from school. She wanted to beat her own record from the year before, 20 boxes, and earn her way to summer camp without costing her mother a cent. At home, her mother's friend offered to buy a box early, right there on the spot. Candy told her no. Sales didn't start until 4 o'clock, and rules were rules. She played with the family dog. She stopped in to see her grandmother. She ate an oatmeal cookie. At 4 o'clock exactly, she headed out door to door through her own neighborhood. Over the next hour and a half, she visited somewhere between 10 and 15 homes. Neighbors remember her? A small girl with an armload of mint boxes, exactly where she was supposed to be. By 5:45, the sun was down. Spokane in March doesn't give you much daylight. By 6 o'clock, her mother, Elaine, felt the particular unease every parent recognizes. A child out just slightly too long. Around 6:30, people who knew Candy placed her on the 2100 block of West Maxwell Avenue. That is the last confirmed sighting anyone has ever been able to give. And at almost that exact same half hour, on that exact same street, a witness watched a 1953 Ford take the corner from Maxwell onto Belt Street hard enough to hit the curb, speeding. A few minutes later, and a few blocks over, Candy's own grandfather, out searching for her already, with another man beside him, had to jump out of the way of a speeding car on that same road. Nobody has ever explained who was driving that car. By 6:30, the family knew something was wrong. They fanned out on foot, calling her name into the dark. By 8 o'clock, police officially joined the search. And by 9 o'clock that night, 5 hours after Candy Rogers left her house with 7 boxes of mints, searchers found 6 of them scattered along North Pettit Drive, on a stretch of road Spokane still calls Doomsday Hill, trailing south toward the Fort George Wright Bridge. 7 boxes issued, 1 sold, 6 found, scattered like she'd dropped them, or thrown them. One of those boxes carried a fingerprint. It was sent to the FBI. That fingerprint would sit in a file, unmatched, for longer than most of the people reading this sentence have been alive. What followed was one of the largest manhunts Washington State had ever seen. More than 1,200 volunteers at its peak. The Air Force, the Marine Corps Reserve, workers from half the major employers in Spokane, searching on foot, on horseback, by car, by air. Local bishops went on the radio, begging anyone with information to come forward, even under the seal of confession, if that's what it took. Then, on March 7th, the search became its own tragedy. A helicopter searching the Spokane River Gorge struck high-tension power lines and went down, killing 3 men, Airman Marlise Ray, Sergeant William McDonnell, and Lieutenant Kenneth Fautek. A city already afraid for one child now grieved 3 grown men who died, trying to find her. 16 days passed, nothing. Then, on March 21st, 2 airmen out hunting on their day off, nothing to do with the official search, found a small pair of blue suede shoes in the woods off Old Trails Road, 7 miles from Candy's home. They looked too clean, too undisturbed to have been there long. Candy's grandfather confirmed they were hers. The next morning, a search party combed the area. Within minutes, a patrolman noticed something in a pile of pine needles and broken branches that didn't belong there. A knee, a child's knee. "No use going any further," he said. "Here she is." Candy Rogers was found about 200 yards from an abandoned rock quarry in the shadow of a rock bluff that had kept the ground cold and out of direct sun for 16 days, which, though nobody understood it yet, helped preserve evidence far better than anyone had any right to expect from 1959. The medical findings the next day were devastating. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, and the evidence showed she had been severely attacked and bound by her captor. There was evidence a ligature had also bound her hands at some point, though it was gone by the time she was found, meaning whatever happened to this child happened over some span of time, in a place far from anyone who could have helped her. And on her clothing, investigators found something small and strange, a smear of grape-flavored chewing gum. It would mean nothing for years, then it would mean everything to the wrong man. Detectives had one piece of physical evidence, that gum. It led them almost immediately to a name, Hugh Bion Morse, a man already known to police for a habit as constant as it was distinctive. He chewed grape gum, always. Morse had a record stretching back to 1951, when he was dishonorably discharged from the Marines after an assault. Burglary in Los Angeles. In 1955, in Fairfield, California, he was arrested for a severe offense involving a young child and was sent not to prison but to a mental health facility where doctors declared him cured 2 years later. 4 months after his release, he was arrested again. In the years around this case, Morse took the lives of at least 4 women across the country: Glory Bree, Blanche Boggs, Bobby Ann Landini, and Mildred Chasteen, and attacked others who survived. He had lived in Spokane. When detectives finally questioned him, he denied everything and passed a polygraph. A polygraph only tells you what a man believes about himself in that moment, not what he did. For decades, Morse remained the department's leading suspect. Right up until 1959's grape gum evidence was tested for DNA in 2001. It excluded him completely. 40 years of certainty, gone in an afternoon. He wasn't the only name on the list. Alfred Graves, 50 years old, took his own life on the exact day Candy's body was found. Police found newspaper clippings about sexual assaults in his home, rope and bobby pins in his car, and no DNA to test. No confession, nothing beyond circumstance and terrible timing. James Howard Barnett, 49, took his own life the following year after his own arrest for alleged crimes against a child. His own widow believed for the rest of her life that he was the one. Neither claim was ever confirmed, neither was ever ruled out. And here is what none of them, guilty or innocent, could have told detectives, because not one of them knew it either. The real killer's name was never written down. Not once in 62 years does it appear in a single report. By the mid-1960s, the tips had dried up completely. The case went colder than the Spokane River in winter, and stayed that way, worked occasionally, revisited by detective after detective, but fundamentally stuck, for almost 4 decades. Then, in 2001, a detective named Mindy Connolly pulled Candy's clothing out of storage and sent it to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. A forensic scientist there, Lisa Turpin, examined the items and isolated a crucial biological sample. Inside it, she found a full male DNA profile, the first physical signature of Candy's killer anyone had ever managed to isolate. It was uploaded to the National CODIS database. Nothing, no match anywhere in the country. But here is the piece of luck nobody in 1959 could have understood the value of. That evidence had been stored, decades earlier, inside a plain glass mason jar, not a plastic bag, which destroys the very evidence it's meant to protect by trapping moisture. A mason jar seals airtight. One detective would later call it beyond belief that this was almost accidental, that one small, unremarkable choice made in an era before anyone had heard the words DNA profile, is the reason any of this was ever possible at all. For years, that DNA profile sat exactly where it had been uploaded, a genetic signature belonging to a ghost, waiting for the technology to catch up to the man who left it there. The case never technically went cold. Detectives kept pulling persons of interest and comparing their DNA against that profile, one at a time, for years. But nothing matched. By 2013, a new forensic scientist named Brittany Wright joined the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. Over the years that followed, she worked on somewhere between 40 and 50 cold cases, and somewhere in that work, she crossed paths with a well-known cold case investigator named Paul Holes, who told her about a company in Texas doing something new: forensic genetic genealogy, building family trees out of crime scene DNA, the way you'd build one out of an old photo album. In 2018, the Golden State Killer, one of the most notorious unsolved serial cases in American history, was identified using exactly that method. It sent a shockwave through cold case units nationwide, including Spokane. The department reassessed every unsolved case on its books. Candy Rogers' file landed on Brittany Wright's desk. She pulled the 20-year-old sample from the crime lab freezer, confirmed it still matched the original profile, and ran a diagnostic to see if there was enough left to attempt genealogy. Then it nearly fell apart completely. The sample was sent to a private lab for testing and arrived in a crushed box. The tube inside was crushed too, and DNA was leaking out. Wright and the lead detective were, in her own words, absolutely devastated. They tried again. This time, the package arrived intact, and the lab's answer was worse than a broken box. The DNA, they said, was simply too degraded to work with. They declined the case. For about a year, Wright believed that was the end of it. Then Sergeant Zach Stormont, working the case out of Spokane's Major Crimes Unit, learned from Wright about a company called Othram, one that specialized in exactly the kind of degraded, decades-old DNA that had just been turned away. He called. The company's founder and CEO called him back the same day. Stormont's fear was simple. There was so little of the sample left that if this attempt failed too, there might be nothing left to try again with. You can't bake the dough twice, Wright would later say. The cost came to around $5,000. Spokane's chain of command approved it without hesitation. In March of 2021, what remained of Candy Rogers' evidence, pulled from a deep freezer, -80 degrees Celsius, still in liquid form after 20 years, was overnighted to Texas. It took 6 months. Then, on Labor Day weekend, Stormont's phone rang. A call like that, from the man at the top of the company, was never going to be small news. It was good news. They had built a profile, and it pointed not to one man, but to 3 brothers, all sharing a last name, all from Spokane. All of them, every single one, are already dead. Genealogy cannot tell 3 brothers apart. On paper, in a family tree, they look identical. So, Stormont did what detectives have always done, just with a much smaller haystack, digging through public records, one brother at a time. 2 had left no children. 1 had, 4 of them, still living, still in Spokane. Stormont found a phone number for the youngest, a daughter, and left a message. Careful. Vague. A cold case, he told her. Nothing more. He would say later that an accusation like the one he was about to make could change a person's entire life, and he didn't feel he had the right to make it over voicemail. She called him back. They met. She agreed to give a DNA sample. 9 days later, the result came back. It was 2.9 million times more likely that this woman was the daughter of Candy Rogers' killer than a random member of the public. But there was a complication. Her mother had had an affair while her husband was overseas in Korea. Paternity, even now, wasn't certain. There was only one way to know for sure. They exhumed the body. On September 23, 2021, investigators opened a grave in Spokane, and the body yielded nothing. No usable DNA after 51 years underground. Wright refused to let that be the end of it. She called a cousin who happened to be a dentist and had him walk her through, step by step, how a root canal works, because she knew that's exactly where a tooth keeps its DNA. She examined 4 teeth from the exhumed remains. 3 gave her nothing. The 4th gave her just enough for one single test. She ran it overnight. The next morning, October 1st, 2021, she called Stormont with 4 words. That's it. It's him. The number that followed is almost impossible to hold in your head. 25 quintillion. That is how much more likely it was that this one man, and not some random person, anywhere on Earth, was the one who left his DNA on Candy Rogers' clothing 62 years, 8 months, and 13 days earlier. His name was John Ray Hoff. He was born on August 11, 1938 in Spokane, and grew up on the 2500 block of West College Avenue. By the time Candy Rogers set out to sell mints on March 6, 1959, he was 20 years old, living on West Broadway Avenue, a little under a mile from her front door, not across town. A mile. He'd had a rough adolescence. In 1955, at 16, he escaped from a state boys training camp near Olympia. At 17, with his parents' signature, he enlisted in the Army, expecting a child of his own at the time. The Army assigned him to a Nike missile installation, part of the ring of surface-to-air defenses protecting Fairchild Air Force Base. One of those installations sat barely 2 miles from the exact wooded area where Candy's body would later be found. The posting gave him an intimate, working knowledge of the back roads and quiet ground of Northwest Spokane, ground most people in that city would never have reason to learn. There was one more thread connecting him to Candy that nobody would find for 62 years. His 10-year-old stepsister was a member of the Camp Fire Girls in 1959, assigned as Candy's so-called big sister in the program. Decades later, when a detective finally tracks her down, now in her 70s, she doesn't remember ever meeting Candy directly. But she remembers crying to her stepbrother about her friend's murder. She had no idea she was crying to the man responsible for it. 2 years after he killed Candy, in 1961, John Ray Hoff attacked another victim, an apartment manager in Spokane's Browns Addition. He subjected her to a violent assault, binding her before she was ultimately able to escape and survive. She survived. Police built a composite sketch from her description, and a military policeman at one of the Nike missile stations recognized him from that sketch alone and named him on site. It should have been the moment everything unraveled. Instead, he served 6 months in jail, was declared an Army deserter, and was quietly discharged. Nobody ever connected him to Candy. Not then. Not for 60 years afterward. He spent the rest of his life doing ordinary things, selling Cutco knives door to door, working at Western Pine Lumber, working at a meatpacking plant, where a chemical accident left a burn across his face that his own family said changed him. On June 30th, 1970, at his home on the 5000 block of West Rosewood Avenue, his wife ran out of the house screaming that he had a gun. Neighborhood children playing outside were called in off the street. John Ray Hoff took his own life in his own doorway. He was 31 years old. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. One of the families who lived next door to him for the last year and a half of his life, close enough to hear that gunshot, close enough that the mother of that family reportedly helped clean up afterward, was Candy Rogers' own family, her cousin, living beside her killer without a single clue for a year and a half, right up until the day he died in his own front door. For 62 years, John Ray Hoff's name never appeared in a single suspect list, a single newspaper story, a single police report. As Sergeant Stormont put it, once the case finally closed, by 1959, he was already a killer. This level of crime isn't where a person starts, it's where they end up, which means somewhere out there, unrecorded and unremembered, there may have been a beginning nobody ever found. On November 19th, 2021, the Spokane Police Department held a press conference. Police Chief Craig Meadle called the moment more bitter than sweet. "We are tenacious," he said. "We will never give up." And then, more simply, we have a kidnapping of an innocent 9-year-old who had absolutely no concept of evil. When someone asked Sergeant Stormont to estimate how many hours had gone into this case, across 6 decades and 3 generations of detectives, he didn't try to count. "This isn't measured in hours," he said. "This is measured in careers." 62 years, 8 months, and 13 days. That clock finally stopped. But solved is not the same word as closed. Remember that fingerprint, lifted off a mint box the very night Candy vanished, sent to the FBI in 1959? It was never identified. Not then. Not in the 62 years since. No source connected to this case has ever said whether it was compared to John Ray Hoff's own prints once his name finally surfaced. As far as the record shows, that print is still, to this day, just a print, unmatched. And that speeding Ford on Maxwell Avenue, the one that nearly hit Candy's own grandfather that same night, detectives themselves have said, on the record, that they still don't know who was behind the wheel. It may have been nothing. It may have been everything. Nobody, not then, not now, has ever been able to say for certain. There was no arrest for John Ray Hoff. There couldn't be one. He had been dead for 51 years by the time his name surfaced. His daughter, the woman whose voluntary DNA sample cracked this case wide open, carried the weight of that discovery entirely alone. She visited her father's grave and told him exactly what she thought of him. She told her pastor she almost wished he were still alive, just so he could stand trial. Her pastor told her something else, that her father had already stood before the one judge that matters. Candy's cousin, Joanne Poss, one of the only people left alive who actually remembers her, put it about as honestly as anyone could. It's not closure, she said, but there's some form of satisfaction in knowing the person who did this is at least named. He may be in a grave, she said, but he's named. Candy's own parents, she said, went to their graves not knowing. That was hard, very hard. And then something quietly good happened, the kind of thing that almost never happens in stories like this one. Joanne Poss and Kathy, the daughter of the man who killed her cousin, met. They became friends. We need to take care of each other, they'd say. Good overcomes evil. Candy Rogers' murder was the reason Spokane opened its first crime laboratory in 1960, funded in part by a community still raw from what had happened to her. It's the reason an entire generation of Spokane children grew up with locked doors, earlier curfews, and mothers who said, "Don't take candy from anyone," without always knowing exactly why. Investigators still have their own working theory about exactly what happened in the hours between 4 o'clock, when Candy left her house, and whatever hour she actually died. A theory involving a change of plans and a stretch of abandoned military land Hoff would have known intimately. Stormont has been careful, every time he's spoken about it, to call that a theory and nothing more. He said publicly that he hopes someone reading the now public case file might confirm it, or prove him wrong. And investigators are still trying to determine whether John Ray Hoff might be connected to any other unsolved crimes in the Spokane area. That thread, as far as anyone has said, remains open. She was 9 years old. She was shy, but very friendly. She was reliable. The kind of daughter a principal would vouch for without hesitation. The kind of granddaughter who stopped in for a visit on an ordinary Friday because that's simply what she did. She was a rule follower, the kind of child who wouldn't sell a single box of mints 1 minute before 4 o'clock, because 4 o'clock was what she'd agreed to. She was somebody's only child. She was somebody's whole world. She was walking home when a stranger, or maybe not even a stranger, took all of that from her, on a street a mile from where he lived, in a city that would spend the next 62 years trying to say her name and mean something by it. She should be 77 years old today. She should have grandchildren of her own, and a life so long and so full that one Friday afternoon in 1959 would be nothing more than a story she told at family dinners about the year she got lost and how scared everyone was, and how it all turned out fine in the end. It didn't turn out fine. But somewhere in the 62 years between her death and her killer's name finally being spoken out loud, something survived her anyway. The refusal of an entire city, across 3 generations of detectives, to let her become just a name in a folder. She was found, not alive, not in time, but found and named and finally, impossibly, answered for. If there's one thing this case leaves you with, it's this. Evidence outlives intention. The detectives who stored Candy's clothing in a simple glass mason jar in 1959 had no idea what DNA was, let alone what it would someday be able to tell us. They just did their job as carefully as they knew how, and trusted that carefulness might matter to someone. Someday they'd never meet. It did. 62 years later, it was the reason a 9-year-old girl finally got her answer. If this case stayed with you, and it should, hit like, subscribe, and tell us which moment landed hardest for you. No case stays cold forever. We'll see you in the next one.